Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas. It's wonderful to see all of your smiling faces today. If the magic of video editing works in my favor, then behind me you'll see a picture of the painting we're going to make today. And before we can get started on that, we need to know what materials we're working with and make sure we have an area laid out where we can get our work done. So ignore this for now. What we're going to start with is we've got a canvas board, 3 different colors of paint, and a paintbrush, brand new paintbrush here. We're also going to need some paper towels and some kind of cup of water to wash our brushes in. Okay, now if your canvas board is still in the plasticky material, the best thing to do is flip it to the back side and just cut with a sharp knife or scissors along, just drag a knife along the edge or drag scissors along the edge until it comes free, and then just pull this and it should come off nice and easily. If your canvas board is already out of the wrapper, that's great, you can skip that step. Now this is trash, so just throw it away, and then we need to open up our paints. Now we've got 3 different colors. When we open these up, we want to keep the lids. Don't throw those away yet. We will use those, or at least 1 or 2 of them, for mixing colors later. So we've got 3 colors. We've got red and green and white. These are our Christmas colors that are going to allow us to make our Christmassy painting today. And last but not least, our paint brush we need to open up. If you've got a brand new brush like this, a lot of times they come with these little sleeves that cover the bristles. And you can keep that and reuse it, put it back on after you've washed it, or you can just toss it. These are really not 100% necessary. I usually just toss those. Now, with a brand new brush, the bristles are often very stiff. And if you feel them, then it kind of feels a little chunky, and that's because they put binder in there, almost like a glue kind of a thing that just keeps those together so that they can put them all into the brush and then package it up nicely and send it to you. That can be washed out really easily, which leads us into the very first part of this lesson. Is anytime I teach paint, I always have to teach how to wash a brush. To wash a brush, you just point your brush straight down into a cup of water and tap gently on the bottom of the cup. If you're doing it right, you shouldn't be able to hear anything. It should be silent. If you hear something, you're doing it wrong. The most common problems that I see kids do are sometimes they turn their brush sideways and ding, 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 ding. And I just splattered water all over myself. That's not a good idea because it splatters water all over the place. The second problem that I see my students do all the time is they stir the water, and again, I just got water all over myself. Don't stir the water. When you're cleaning your brush, just tap gently on the bottom of the cup. That's all it takes. Now, we are using a dry brush method today, which means that every time you wash your brush, you want to dry it. So I've washed my brush, I'm gonna dry it by wiping that little droplet of water onto the cup and then wipe the rest of the water off onto the paper towel. Now, it's still a little damp, but it's not like loaded with water. That's gonna be important because with these tempera paints, if you have too much water in your brush, then it will thin the paints out and they will just kind of end up spreading around like watercolors and making a big mess, and we don't want that. We want to be able to control our paints. Now I have this extra brush here because I wanted to show you what to not do with your paints. I see this all the time and it bugs me. When you are painting, you should only put the tip of the bristles into the paint, like that. So here, only about half of the bristles is covered in paint. Did I get any paint on this metal part here? The ferrule? No, that's called a ferrule, the metal part. I didn't get any paint there. The paint is only on the bristles. If you get paint up any higher than the bristles, then it's game over. It's like you can't clean it off properly. So when you get paint out of your tubs, just dip the tip of the bristles in and don't dip them all the way in. And what you definitely don't want to do, why do people do this? I see people scoop the paint up like this all the time, and it just makes a huge mess. Don't do that. Don't do that. All you're doing is making people crazy. Anyway, the one last bit of our supplies here is I have this black paper underneath everything. You could use newspaper, you could just use a table that's allowed to get dirty. Some people do this kind of thing outside and then just spray the table down with a hose when they're done. These are washable paints, so if you get it on like your nice fancy dinner table, that's not the end of the world. You can just wipe it up with soap and water. But I like to just cover my table with some kind of paper or something so that I don't have to wipe it clean. I can just throw the paper away when I'm done. Anyway, that's it for setup. Now we're ready to get started. We're going to be painting some candy canes today. Now I brought an actual for realsies candy cane so that we could analyze it and look at some, visual elements that we see here. And the first thing that we see is that it's shaped like the letter J. And then the second thing that we see is that it's got red and white stripes. Those stripes are not horizontal or vertical, they're diagonal and they wrap around, spiral around. So we're gonna have to do that when we paint ours. We're gonna paint two candy canes that cross over each other in an X, and then we're gonna have some holly leaves at the bottom, and then we're gonna have a border around the edges. For starters, we want our candy canes to be just about life size. This is an 8 by 10 inch canvas, and so life size candy canes, notice it's not going to go all the way from the bottom to the top, but it's also not going to be a teeny tiny little candy cane in the middle. We want it to be about a life size candy cane. And if you have real candy canes to compare to, you can use it to compare, which I will show you here in just a minute. Or you can just kind of eyeball it if you don't have any candy canes to compare to. So I'm going to load my brush, get half the bristles covered in red paint. We're going to start with red. And I'm going to make my sort of J shape leaning over, I say J shape. If you look at it this way, it's a J. If you look at it this way, it's like a really tall R, I guess, kind of. Anyway. Whatever you want to call it, whatever shape you want to call it. So it's going to be nice and straight for the long run, and then it's going to curve and hook over. And now mine is terrible because I didn't have enough paint on my brush. Does that mean I should scoop up a whole bunch of paint and then, no. I'm going to do a little bit at a time. I'm going to get a little bit more paint on my brush. You see how it's kind of pink up here? I'm going to need to add more paint there. I'm also going to add more here to make it a little bit thicker, because if I compare this to a real candy cane, that line is really thin compared to the candy cane. So I want to make it thicker. And I do that by just going right beside the line I already have here. To make it thicker. And so you can see this part is thicker than this part. Now I've run out of paint on my brush, so I'm going to go back. It's important. You're going to keep going back and forth. A lot of times I see people who like, it's working really good. We're getting a lot of paint on the canvas here, and then they just keep trying to keep going without ever going back to the paint, and then it's like kind of looking pink and it's not filling the whole area all the way, and you're like, why doesn't it work, Mr. New? Why doesn't it work? It's because you need to go get more paint, that's why. So just go get a little bit more paint and then keep going, and then go get more paint and then keep going. You go back and forth. It's not all going to happen the first go. Okay. Now, it is also important to note that I am spreading my paint in a thin layer. I don't want big glops of paint, especially because we're going to be doing some layering. And the layers that go on top, we're not going to want to blend with. We're going to want any layers that go on top, we're going to want it to cover, not blend. So I don't want to have big, thick globs of paint on there. I want to take, and this is also part of what we call the dry brush method of painting. If you use big, thick globs of paint, that's called an impasto style of painting. We're doing a dry brush style, which means we're using a brush that's dry, right? We washed it, but then we dried it, and we're letting the paint do the painting. We're not trying to let any water do the painting, and we're making thin layers of paint that can overlap and cover each other and layer. Okay. Alrighty. Now you might be thinking, why have I made the entire candy cane red? Mr. New, this candy cane has more white than red. Yeah, it does, you're right. We're going to add the white on top. And like I said, that's another reason we're going to be doing layering. That's another reason why you don't want big, thick globs of paint. Okay, so I'm spreading my paint, smoothing it out across the canvas so that it's nice and thin. That helps it dry quicker. Now, comparing that to that, that's pretty good, pretty good. I might want to make, by the way, I wasn't like setting this down on top of there. I was hovering it over. And what I'm noticing is that this part of the candy cane could be a little bit longer, and that part I made a little bit too long, but it's close enough. I'm not freaking out about tiny little details. My next candy cane is going to cross over it like this, okay? So that curve is going to flip the other direction. It's going to basically make an X, all right? And I do the second candy cane exactly the same way I did the first. I'll start by getting that J shape, that hook shape. And then get a little bit more paint at a time, thicken up the line. And make sure that it has enough coverage, right? Like if we look at this area here, the paint looks thin and scratchy and you can see little white dots through it. I don't want that. I want it to be completely red. So I'm making sure that I have enough paint to cover. We want good coverage of our paint. We want it to cover those little white dots. But we don't want big, thick globs of paint. We want to spread it nice and thin. So notice how I'm taking my time, kind of going over the same area again and again, getting a nice smooth layer of paint there. There's no rush. Doesn't have to be done in 5 seconds. Okay? All right. Finish off the top of this candy cane here. Now, I just got some paint on my hand because I set it down on top of that. It's when you're drawing, a lot of times we put our hand down on the paper while we draw. When you're painting, you really don't want to do that. That's a bad habit to get into. So what you want to do is kind of hover your hand up above. You don't want to lay it down. I accidentally smudged off a little bit of that paint with my hand. It'll smear around, it'll make big, huge messes, and those are kind of impossible to clean up. So I'm glad I caught myself doing that, because there have been times when I have completely ruined pictures that really shouldn't have been ruined. So learn from my mistakes, or make the mistake yourself and learn for yourself. Either way. Don't put your hand on wet paint. Okay, so there, we've got our 2 candy canes. Again, I could compare that side by side with this one, say that, yeah, it's pretty good, pretty close to the right size. Maybe not perfect, but pretty close. Now, notice I haven't washed my brush since the very beginning, because I've been using the same color. But I'm about to switch and use white. Before I switch, I don't want to put this red paint into that white tub, so I want to wash my brush. Should I go ding, ding, ding? No. I should tap, tap, tap gently on the bottom of the cup. And then I should wipe it dry here and wipe it dry here. And this is where this really small, fine point, round detail brush is really going to shine for making these diagonal stripes of white on top of the red. Now, this is where I'm going to change my mind about something I said just a minute ago. A minute ago, I said we don't want big, thick glops of paint. But let me show you something here on a test paper. Here's some red paint that's dry. If I take this white and I put it on kind of thin, it turns pink because you can see through it. It's transparent. So we're gonna have to put a kind of thick layer of white on top. To do that, we're gonna load up our brush the same way we did with the red. We don't wanna load it up, we don't wanna scoop it. We just want, the first half of the bristles to have paint on it. And then this is where we gotta be super careful. Let me show you here. I don't want to push the bristles down to where they're spreading out. I want them instead to just ever so gently touch so that I'm making lines, okay? I don't know if you could see that on the camera or not, but I'm going to do it again here. I want it to just ever so gently touch so that it makes a line, okay? Ever so gently touch so that it makes a line. And those lines are diagonal to the direction of the candy cane, right? Compared to the candy cane, those are diagonal. And different candy canes have different patterns of like thick stripe and then 3 small stripes or whatever. But like, you decide how you want your stripage to look, but just make it a pattern. Like if you want, 2 stripes close together and then a 3rd stripe farther apart, just make them consistent or as close to consistent as you can. Now I find usually I can get about 2 or 3 strokes here, 2 or 3 lines here before I'm running low on paint and I need to go load up again. If your line starts to be thin and wispy and pink, then you don't have enough paint. Just go reload, just touch the white paint again. And I can get about 1, 2, 3 lines and then go back for more. Here's where I have to decide which candy cane is in front, overlapping. I'm going to let this one that I'm working on right now be the one that's in front, overlapping. And we'll talk more about that again when we start doing the stripes on the other candy cane. But for now, I'm just going to keep going on this candy cane. And like I said earlier, this is why we didn't want to have big, thick layers of that red paint. If it was thick layers of red paint, then this would be mixing with the red and turning pink. We don't want it to be pink, we want it to be red and white. Now, this is the tricky part. As this curves, we need to curve our diagonal stripes. So the stripes are going to start going in different directions. There. I got one of my candy canes done. When I do this next candy cane, I've got to consider this place where they overlap. There's going to be some interesting things that happen there. All right, but let's start by just making those diagonal stripes until we get up to that point. Once we reach that point, we're going to want to consider two things. Number one, by the rules of overlapping, these stripes should stop here and then start again on the other side of the overlapping. And then the second thing is we are going to want to have a little bit of a cast shadow. When two things overlap each other, whatever's on top will cast a shadow onto the thing under it. For example, if you look closely, you can see that my hand is putting a shadow on the canvas underneath it right here, right? When two things overlap each other, they will cast a shadow onto each other. And you might be thinking, Mr. New, we don't have any black paint. How are we going to make a shadow if we don't have any black paint? Well, you don't need black paint to make a shadow. Shadows are not usually black. They're only black if the light is really, really, really limited. For example, like if it's nighttime, you might see really black shadows, but at nighttime, everything is kind of black and dark anyway. So, no, shadows are usually just a darker color, a darker version of whatever color the object is. In this case, we have red candy canes. So I just need a darker red, right? Well, you might think, well, I need to mix some black with my red to make it darker. No, actually, you just need to mix a dark color with your red to make it darker. Let me show you. I'm going to wash my brush. I do not want to mix white when I'm making a color darker. So I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to dry my brush. Okay, so I have a clean, dry brush, and I'm going to grab one of these lids. On that lid, I am going to load up some red paint and just kind of smush it onto there. Then, I don't want to contaminate my green paint, so I'm going to wash my brush, dry my brush, and grab a little bit of green. And kind of smudge it beside. I'm going to get a little bit more than that. So here on this thingy, I have some red and some green. I don't want to mix all of it together. What I want to do is mix a little bit of green. I've got just a little bit of green on my paint brush. I want to just kind of stir that into the red. I don't want to do too much. You'll see right away that that gets quite a bit darker. Is that dark enough for my shadow? Probably just like that is dark enough for my shadow. I got way more green than I needed there. Okay, all right, for the shadow only goes on the object that's underneath. So right here at the edge where they overlap, that's where I'm putting my shadow color. Okay? And so it looks like this candy cane here is casting a shadow onto the one under it. Looks a little bit three-dimensional because of that. And I can just leave this here. I can come back to that later if I need that again. But I need to clean my brush before I move on and paint some holly. Some holly. Clean and dry. You want a dry brush. Always a dry brush. I've cleaned it. I've wiped it dry. And now I'm going to put some holly down here at the bottom. To make the holly down at the bottom, I'm going to load my brush with green. Again, just a tiny little bit. We don't need much. And I want to kind of shape out some holly leaves. Okay, well, my first holly leaf, I'm going to start with just a sort of curved line that comes from the middle underneath my candy canes and just curves across. That kind of gives the central core of that holly leaf. And then I kind of want to make a small curve that bumps in towards that line under it, and then a small curve that bumps in towards that line above it. So you can see how it's almost like the divide symbol, if you know what division looks like, if you know about the dividing symbol. If you don't know what the dividing symbol looks like, then you can think of this like three lines that curve, and the two that are on the top and bottom like bump in towards each other, okay? And then we're going to connect from the end of this middle line to the top and bottom with more curves, curves that bump in. Like that. And then we're just going to fill that whole shape with green. We'll come back later and we'll add some highlights to make these leaves really shine. But for now, we just want to get the shapes of the leaves. So we just want to fill that with some green. Now we want to recreate that shape a couple of times. Maybe 3 holly leaves would be a good number. To do that, I'm going to make my second leaf go the opposite direction. So it's going to come kind of from the center here, right next to where that one started. And it's going to curve across that direction. No need to make these perfect. They don't need to be exactly the same. All right, above and below, little bumps. Think of it, I guess you could think of it like a wide frown with a tiny smile above it and then a tiny frown below it. Yeah, let's make that a little wider. Anyway, connect the dots with these little curves and fill it in completely with your green. Think about when you're filling it in, just do it just kind of the same way we did the candy canes. You don't want big, thick, gloopy glops. You want to thin it out, spread it out. We can always work in layers. If we need it to be a darker green, we can mix a little bit of red into it. If we need it to be a lighter green, we can mix a little bit of white into it. Okay, let's do one more leaf, a third leaf, kind of going up. Kind of like that. And the curve on this side, the curve on this side, and then curve on down. And curve on up. And then fill it in completely with your green. Now, if you used a nice clean brush when you did that, it should be a pretty bright green. If you used a clean brush and you spread the paint out, then it will be a nice bright green. That's because these paints are a little bit transparent. You can see the white shining through them, the white canvas underneath it shining through it. You could build it up in layers if you want it to be darker, or you could mix a little bit of red in if you want it to be darker. But I think a bright green is really going to pop here. I am going to be making some highlights and some shadows. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to grab another little tray here, put some green on it, and wash my brush, dry my brush. Oh, I should have dried it here first, then on the paper towel. And then I'm going to get some white. Now, white is usually a weak pigment. It takes a lot of white to mix with a little bit of a color. So I've got some white and I've got some green, and I'm just gonna, I don't need to wash my brush while I'm working on here, so I'm just gonna pick up a little bit of this green here, mix it with some white, maybe mix it with a little bit more white until I have what I think is going to be a nice bright green highlight color. We're just going to think, which way is the light shining? I always like to say the light is shining in from the top right. So on the top and on the right side of each, no, that needs more white mixed into it. On the top and on the right side of each leaf, I'm going to do just a little, this is what we call a rim light. A rim light. Just a highlight around the edge. On the right side of the leaf, on the top of the leaf. Just a highlight around the edge. Then I want to do the opposite, a shadow on the opposite sides. But before I wash my brush and do that, I'm going to also do a little bit of a highlight across the core, the middle, the main vein, going down the middle of each of these leaves. Yeah, kind of like that. All right, then I want some shadows. Now for this, I'm going to wash my brush because I do not want any white in my shadows, and my brush has white in it. Then I'm going to dry my brush. And come back to this tray. Now this tray is pretty dry, so I might need, like, I've still got some green here, but my sort of dark color there is dry. My dark red is dry. So what I want to do is just get a little bit more red to mix in with my green. Now, when I mixed my dark red, I had a lot of red and just a tiny touch of green. To mix my dark green, I'm going to have a lot of green and just a tiny touch of red. So I'll do that over here. I've got mostly green, and I'll mix a little bit of red into it. And that's going to make it a dark green. Okay, now I'm going to use that dark green color. Since the highlights were on the top right, I'm going to make the dark shadows on the bottom left. On the bottom and on the left of each leaf. And this is just a rim shadow. Okay, on the bottom and on the left of each leaf. And then along the underside of the core, right underneath that bright highlight, touching directly next to that bright highlight, touching directly next to that bright highlight, touching directly underneath that bright highlight. There, so that gets sort of some three-dimensionality and some variety to our leaves. Now I'm washing my brush and drying my brush. And the next step, I'm going to make some holly berries. These are going to be super simple. I just load up with a little bit of red. Make a couple of tiny little circles. We do want them to be nice circles. And I like to put them in groups of 3. Nice little circles. We'll come back and add a bright, shiny highlight onto that in a minute. I'm going to make another group of 3 berries right here. Tiny little circles. Maybe I'll have another group of berries over here. These do not have to be symmetrical. They don't have to be the same on both sides. As a matter of fact, you do want it to be balanced, where you have about the same amount happening on both sides. But if they're all in the same place, it's gonna feel clunky and weird. It's not gonna feel natural. If there's approximately the same amount, but in slightly different places, it's gonna feel more natural. All right, and then I think a couple up here. That one right there turned out a little lumpy, so I'm just gonna make it more round. All right, I'm already loving that. The next step, wash and dry. I'm gonna switch to white and add just a tiny little white highlight. So I'm gonna load my brush with white and just touch ever so gently the top right, just make a dot on the top right of each little berry. And that tiny little touch of white is just gonna help make each of those berries feel shiny. Just that pure white. I'm not trying to make a bright pink there. I'm just making that perfect white. That is it. All done except for the border. Now the border, there is no wrong way to do the border. You can decide how you want to do the border. If you want a nice rectangular border that's, you know, nice straight lines, you can do that. If you want a wavy border, you can do that. If you want red and green stripes, you can do that. If you want red and green and white stripes, you can do that. The border is totally up to you. I'm gonna make my border the way I wanna make my border, and then just show it to you when I'm done, and you can choose how to make your border however you want. And there it is, done. Last thing to do is to sign it. I need a clean, dry brush for that. I'm going to choose a color. Which color do I want to sign it with? I think I will sign it with green. I can decide anywhere to sign it, really any empty space, but I want my signature to be a small, I want it to be visible where people know that I'm the one who made it, but I don't want it to be like in your face, like my name shining off of the page. So I'm gonna put it kind of underneath one of these candy canes, and my signature, I like to just put my initials, N, C, N, and a little swooshy underneath. There we go. All done. That's all there is to it for making our Christmassy candy caney picture. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I can't wait until our paths cross again. Have a Merry Christmas, everybody.